Hello and welcome to Little Elizabeth Bakes Coffee Cake. Those who know me will tell you that coffee cake is my thing. I enjoy making it, experimenting with it, and of course, enjoying it with my morning coffee. The coffee cake I made this week is one version of many to come. This is one of my more frugal versions, but it will be so fun to make more in the future that include sour cream, butter, berries, different pan sizes, and many more substitution possibilities and flavors. If you have any ideas you want me to try, leave a comment below. The version I've made this week is not one I'd title World's Best Coffee Cake. It's delicious, yes, but this one would win the award for most serviceable coffee cake before it would stand up with the likes of sour cream coffee cake. Nonetheless, this one is always enjoyed and, more importantly, accessible to me for those days where I think to myself, you know what we really need? A good old coffee cake. On to the video. So how do we make a cake? So we have, in a normal box cake mix, which most people have made, we're going to have half a cup of oil, a cup of water, about 3 or 4 eggs, usually 3. And that's being added to 2 cups of flour, a cup of sugar, and the leavener and salt and everything. So that's the typical cake ratio. But with coffee cake, we're going for something denser and richer and a little more moist. And the question is, could you just add water to a normal cake recipe to make it more moist? Well, if you do that, you'll end up with a very soupy batter, and it will burn on the top and not be done in the middle. It'll take 2 hours to bake. You're not going to want that. So in order to make a coffee cake, we need to make it more fatty. That's how you make it more moist and denser. So on the one hand, you'll have the ratios that are like a biscuit, which is, along with the dry ingredients, you're going to have cut in butter, like cold butter, cut in the batter, along with some sort of cream. I usually use buttermilk. And on the other hand, you're going to have a cake ratio, which is typically involving oil added to the dry ingredients along with water or milk. But we're going to meet somewhere in the middle where we're going to use oil and cream. So some sort of heavy, something a little heavier than milk typically, hopefully buttermilk at the very least. We could use sour cream, we could use heavy cream. With a normal cake, what you'll usually see is when you pull up the paddle in the mixer, you're going to see it just dripping because the batter of a normal cake is kind of wetter and drippier. But with a coffee cake, you're going to end up finding that it's a thicker batter because it's a little more dense, the crumb is a little more tender, so it's not going to floof up and be spongy like a normal cake would be. It's going to be a little crummier, a little bit wetter, and that's perfectly fine. All right, we're going to start with the oil. We're going to do 2/3 of a cup of oil. And to be honest, this is one of those ingredients that I kind of just guesstimate on. I just say, oh, there's a little in the bowl, just like with a box cake mix. If I make a box cake mix, oh, there's about a half cup of oil in there. I go a little bit more than that, but yeah, about this much. If you look in the bowl, okay, that'll work for a cake. This channel is not about, oh, this is the perfect ratio, this is the perfect recipe for the ideal coffee cake. This is not that. This is just what I do. It's a serviceable, basic ingredient, normal ingredient coffee cake. All right, so we have oil, and I have a cup of sugar here already rationed out. Okay, and then, of course, 3 eggs. And not to forget the vanilla. You can do 1.5 teaspoons. I'm just going to guesstimate. Now today, I actually don't have sour cream, I don't have heavy cream, I just have milk. And that's typically going to happen in most homes anyway. So here's a recipe, you're just gonna need normal stuff. We're gonna use milk. We're going to make it into buttermilk using vinegar or lemon juice. I like to use vinegar. So it's going to be, how much is it? About 1 1/4 cup. I'm going to get that ready so that we can alternate the dry ingredients with the wet ingredients and mix it together really nice. So I made a mistake last time I made the coffee cake. I added too much vinegar. And I was kind of experimenting, see what it would be like if I just added like a 1/4 cup of vinegar along with milk and then a normal baking soda amount. And I'll tell you what happened. So during the baking process, about halfway through, it was poofing up so much that it was overcoming all the streusel topping, and it was really, really bubbly. Not like it was making a mess, but it was just not right. But it ended up being a really good coffee cake anyway. Ended up being nice and light, but also, well, if you're going for light, it's good. But it was too much leavening agent, so I probably would reduce that. I used a little too much baking soda, a little too much vinegar, and ended up just being a little weird. It didn't have any doming happening. It just was like, ended up being flat at the end of the baking, and it just wasn't what I was going for. So be careful not to use too much vinegar. Usually 1 tablespoon is perfectly fine. So I just put a little splash in there, and I'm gonna put milk up here too. 1 1/4 cups. And I'll keep the milk on standby because sometimes I feel like, oh, that batter is so dry. I want to add a little bit more, and that's fine. You can do that. I'm just going to set this aside, and I'll save it for when I have the dry ingredients ready to go. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about the sugar amount. If you ever wanted to reduce the sugar in this recipe, just remember that sugar is actually considered a wet ingredient, a liquid ingredient in the cake recipe. So if you do reduce the sugar at any point in a recipe, remember that you need to slightly increase the liquid, whether it be milk or maybe adding half an egg or even just a little water. But you need to compensate for that lack of sugar at some point. 2 cups of flour. And then I'm going to get salt and baking soda. One teaspoon of salt. And 1 teaspoon of baking soda. And I talked about this in the last video, but there is a difference between baking powder and baking soda, and that is baking soda is the actual leavening agent, but baking powder is the leavening agent with the activating ingredient to the leavening agent. So if you're using baking powder, typically this is all you need. But with baking soda, you'll need something to activate it. Usually that's some enzyme in buttermilk or vinegar in this case, or lemon juice. Any acid can activate the baking soda, which is what we need. We already have the vinegar in there. I'm going to whisk this together and start incorporating it in here with the milk, alternating it. With the mixing, if you mix it a little bit, you'll end up with a nice dense crumbly cake. If you mix it a lot, like over 30 seconds or more than is just incorporated all in there, you're going to end up with a normal, more spongy cake texture. Normally we want that, but with this I try to keep it to the minimum. So if you beat the batter more, you're going to be developing gluten. And if you think about gluten, normally we associate that with bread, which is kneaded pretty extensively. The reason we need bread is to develop the protein gluten, and it holds the dough together better so that when you cut it, it's not like crumbling apart on you. So the more you knead something, or the more you mix something, the more gluten is developed when it has flour involved. Don't forget to scrape the bowl as well. I went ahead and added an extra 1/4 cup of flour because the batter was looking a bit too drippy for what I was wanting. And this is something I do all the time, by the way. You can, with the most recipes, you can add a little more flour or a little more milk a little bit later in the recipe, and it's fine. Most recipes are pretty forgiving in that way, at least when it comes to this kind of baked good. If you're going for a cheesecake, I probably wouldn't recommend it. Okay, so what's the other thing you think of when you think of coffee cake? Some sort of cinnamon swirl or cinnamon streusel. So I'm going to develop the cinnamon swirl right now. And I like to use brown sugar, so I'm going to use brown sugar. You could use white sugar or a mixture of the two. And I'm not going to use more than 1/3 of a cup of sugar total for this. I'm just going to pack loosely the brown sugar in and then mix 1 tablespoon of cinnamon with it. Fun fact, I found out that coffee cake as we know it today has existed since the 50s. Apparently some Jewish women in Minnesota first made the pound cake like coffee cake that we know. But coffee cake has been around since the 1600s to go with coffee and tea and stuff like that. So it used to be that they used to make it with the yeast dough instead of a leavening agent like baking soda or baking powder. It used to be less of a cake and more of a bread, but I'm happy for where it is right now. All right, so really you're only supposed to mix it a little bit. I mixed a little too much. That's okay too. What I'd like to do is have a ribbon of cinnamon sugar through it. So ideally that's what you're going for. So what you'd like to do, even though I messed up with this, I mixed it too much, what you'd like to do is you'd like to have your nice thick batter, which I'll show you in just a moment, and then you'd like to dump the sugar cinnamon mixture on top, and then just gently with a spatula, not with the beater like this, you're going to want to, with a spatula, stir it in just gently until there's a swirl of cinnamon in there, and then you'll be dumping it carefully into your pan. It's not like a science or anything, it's just for fun. Gotta grease the pan. You could also flour the pan. You know what? I'll do that right now. So I decided to go ahead and do it. I got a little flour in the pan that's already greased. I'm just going to tap the flour around until it basically coats the bottom and some of the sides, so it's easier to keep it detached from the pan, to keep the cake detached from the pan. And you'll be able to tell if you did a good job greasing the pan, if it actually sticks to everything. In this case, I did a decent job. I just tapped the extra flour out of here, and now I'm going to just pour this in. Oh, I forgot I was going to show you. It's pretty thick. And as you can see, I pretty well mixed that cinnamon topping in there, or that cinnamon swirl in there, which is unfortunate because I was really hoping for a nice ribbon of cinnamon in there, but you guys can do that on your own if you want. Maybe next time. So I already have some topping made from the other day when I made a coffee cake, so I'm just going to use this. But I will share my recipe with you. That is 4 tablespoons of butter, 1/3 of a cup of flour, 1/3 of a cup of oatmeal, that's quick oats, 1/4 cup of brown sugar, and 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. And you can add a few chopped nuts in there if you want, like 1/4 cup. You can even add a little more butter than there. It's up to you. I usually just use the same bowl as I used for the batter. Same thing with the breakfast bar recipe that I did. It actually helps clean out the pan. The crumbs help dry out the batter that's left in here, and then you can just pour it on top and you just have one bowl to wash other than the dry ingredient bowl. A long time ago, I was at someone's house, I think it was when I was a teenager, and they started making an apple crisp. And one thing I didn't notice was the recipe around. They were just doing what they thought was best for apple crisp. They were doing apples, they were doing sugar, they were doing cinnamon, and they were doing the topping. They were using butter, and they were using brown sugar and flour and oats. And my mind was blown. How could you do that without a recipe? And that is the beginning of my baking philosophy in general, is if you figure out the basics of what you want in something, you can pretty much crack the code. You can pretty much make whatever you want in that category. So I'm not saying I know everything about baking, I just have become familiar with the things I want to become familiar with. I'm gonna try something that I've done before, and that is, since my topping is really dry, I still want to make it a little more, I want the crumbs to be thicker, like a real streusel, so I'm going to add some milk. There we go. Alright, so now we're going to have bigger crumbs of it. I like that better. The version I'm doing today has a few extra crushed nuts in here. I'm not gonna fuss about that. I just wanted to use up what I had in the fridge. And I hope my family doesn't notice.